Welcome to today's session. It is the third part of our identity series on adding the Microsoft authentication libraries to your JavaScript applications. I hope I got that right. You know what you're here for. This is the good one. We're going to be talking about connecting Azure services. And with that, I will turn things over to Sydney, who will get all the details right.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot for the great introduction, Matt. Welcome everyone to the third part in our four-part series where we're talking about taking these JavaScript applications that we're building and connecting them to the Microsoft Identity Platform. So Matt, you did get that right. So this is the third part in a four-part series. Matt has been gracious enough to post links to our YouTube channel. So if you miss any of the previous sessions in the series, don't worry. You can go to the YouTube channel and check out those. Check out our previous sessions. The great part about today is that we'll do a couple little housekeeping slides, but it's almost all code, all demo. So really excited to really dig into this with you today. So let's start with just a little bit of housekeeping. My name is Sydney Andrews, just like Matt said. I'm an Azure MVP. I've been working on the developer side of Azure for many years, both as someone who has consulted and given consultant services, and as someone who has focused very heavily on teaching concepts for developers who are on the Azure platform. Now, we're going to talk about quite a lot of technical stuff today, and all of our demo and source code, they're on GitHub. I already posted it in the Q&A, but github.com/msusdev, Microsoft Identity Platform Dev. That's our repo. Please go there, check out our demo source code. Again, this is going to be a very technical session, so if you run into anything and you say, I got some questions about this, while we're here live, go ahead and put those questions in the Q&A. If you come up with questions after this session, if I'm only human, I may answer your question. You feel like you need a follow-up or a deeper answer. msusdev@microsoft.com. Once again, that's msusdev@microsoft.com. That's our email. Please email us and let us know what questions, feedback, any type of help you need with this series. So this is our roadmap. In the first session, we talked about how we can authenticate users in JavaScript applications using Msl.js libraries. Had a lot of fun. We're really going to build on that today. In our second session, we took a little bit of detour and talked about the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, which is just a really cool way if you don't want to write as much code to integrate in with the Microsoft Identity Platform and Msl. But today, we're going to go right back to the super dev, super tech-heavy stuff and talk about how we can authenticate to Azure services using Msl.js. We're going to use Azure Storage as a great example today for a couple of reasons. One is if you are playing around in your demo subscriptions, Azure Storage is a pretty inexpensive service. So you can spend quite a few of them, do a lot of demos and tests and examples and not have to spend a lot of money. If you're using the Azure free tier, storage is included in that. So again, storage is the most accessible service to learn on. So that's why we're going to double click and focus on Azure Storage today. But everything I teach you today can be applied to many of the other JavaScript libraries for the Azure SDK. And again, all the concepts I teach you today will focus on using them with Azure Storage, but it can be used across the board. The final session after this is we'll talk about the Microsoft Graph SDK. In session 1, and you'll see today, we'll make a couple of calls to the graph. We usually do that as a sanity check, but we do them manually using the fetch method if it's client side and the fetch library if it's server side. But that's just a very manual way of doing things. In the session after this, we'll talk about using the Graph SDK to do that in a nice, clean way with a really great JavaScript library. All right, so today's agenda. We are going to use the Msl Node library, which is a flavor of Msl specifically designed for server-side node applications. We will use that to create requests. We'll go to the graph first so that we can all level set. And then from there, we'll go to Azure Storage. Once we've done that manually, we'll go ahead and use default Azure Credential provider. I'll talk about the different Azure Credential providers that are available in the Azure SDK. And that's not just for JavaScript. That's for across the board of languages. We're just using JavaScript for our demos today. And then we'll wrap up by creating our own custom credential provider. So with all that said, this is my last slide. Let's actually dig into Msl.js. So what I like to do to start is I like to walk you through our environment. Got a couple things going today. We have the Azure portal. I have a couple of resource groups and subscriptions. We're going to create a resource group. I'm going to call this resource group webinar. And I'm going to spin it up in ECUS. So super simple, creating a resource group, calling it webinar, spinning up at ECUS. Nothing too crazy here. I'm going to the review pane to make sure everything I typed in is valid. I'm going to hit create, and it's creating my resource group called webinar. That's where we're going to put everything that we're going to use today. Now, we'll also create an Azure Active Directory application registration. Now, I'm going to be a little efficient when I'm going through some of these things because we talk about them deeply in the first session. But if you haven't seen the first session, please jump on our YouTube channel, youtube.com, Microsoft Dev Radio. Matt has put the link in the Q&A. And take that link, go look at session 1 if you haven't seen it. We go much deeper into the mechanics of how you create an Azure AD application registration. But today, I'm just going to go to Azure Active Directory. I'm going to go to App Registrations. I'm going to create a new registration called Webinar. That's what we're going to use today. Now, I'm going to keep things super simple. Only accounts in my organizational directory. I'm not going to make this a multi-tenant registration, and I'm not going to support personal Microsoft accounts. As far as my redirect URI, I'm building a server-side node application, so I'm going to just put in HTTP localhost. Now, this is if I want to do any type of client-side authentication. I don't have to set this up at all, but I'm just showing you how I would. Once we've done that, we have all the information we need. But today, we're going to build server-side applications. Now, the idea with these server-side applications is I intend to run them in an unintended manner, right? Pun intended. And the idea here is that I need something to validate that I'm actually authorized to run this application. So what I'm going to create is a client secret. This is something I can pass to the Msl library saying that, hey, this is permission for this Azure AD application, not a specific user, but this actual application to access an API. So I'm going to go to certificates and secrets, and I'm going to create a new client secret. Now I'm going to call this webinar day, because we're just doing this for the webinar, and I'm going to expire it in 3 months. So hit add, and I have a new client secret. I'm going to go ahead and copy the value of this client secret. I'm going to introduce you to the rest of our environment today. So we have Visual Studio Code. This is where we're going to be doing our development. And we have Windows Terminal. This is where we'll be running command line applications. So going to Visual Studio Code, I'm just going to create a new file. I'm not going to name, well, actually, not going to name it. I'm just going to use this as a place to put my stuff. So I have a secret. There's the value of my secret. Great. I have a client ID. I'm going to go back to the Azure portal, go back to overview here, and grab my client ID. Copy that to the clipboard, going back to Visual Studio Code, and paste that. And finally, I have a tenant ID. This is the unique GUID for my Azure Active Directory tenant. Since I'm only allowing sign-ins from people or applications or identities within this tenant, I need the tenant ID. So I'm going to go back, and it's right here in the same overview panel. I'm going to copy that and paste that to Visual Studio Code. Keep the things real simple, all right? Now from here, I'm going to go back to the portal, and I'm going to set up an API. Now today, I'm not going to log in myself, but I'm going to have this Azure Active Directory application login. So that's what the client secret is going to be used for. So when I do that, I need to give this application permission to do stuff. So today, I'm going to go to aka.ms/ge. That's the Graphic Explorer. I'm going to put that in the Q&A. HTTPS aka.ms/ge, which is the shortcut to the Microsoft Graphic Explorer. Now from here, you can see I'm already signed into Graphic Explorer. If I want to read my data because I'm signed in, I can go to Microsoft.com version 1.0 of me. But if I wanted to list all the users in my directory, I'll go to the users endpoint, hit run query, and I'll see I have all the users in my directory. Pretty cool stuff. Now, from here, if I go to modify permissions, and if you haven't seen the Graphic Explorer, again, go check out our first sessions video on YouTube. But from here, we have our modify permissions tab, and we can see all the different permissions that we can use to get here, like directory read all or user.read all. I'm going to go with user.read all because this will allow some application or some person to read all the users and profile properties in my directory. So I'm going back to my Azure AD application registration, and I'm going to select API permissions. Now, we already have user.read. It's a delegated permission, so that means a user signs in and they can read their profile. But I want to add a new permission, so I'm going to select add a permission. And from here, I'm going to select Microsoft Graph. I mean, there's lots of options here. We'll click on a couple others later. But we're going to select Microsoft Graph today. And we can do delegated permissions. That means if the user is logged in as a signed-in user, they're delegating that permission to our application. Or we can give our application its own direct permissions. I'm going to select application permissions here. And I want to give this application, which is on webinar, permission to user.readAll. So I'm scrolling down. There's my user group. Just select user.readAll and hit add permissions. Now, just like with everything else in Azure AD, when you log in, the first time the user logs in and wants to do something, it presents them with a screen that says, hey, you need to give consent to do this. Now, if this is a standalone server-side unattended application, there's no way for me to manually or interactively give consent. So I'm going to go ahead and grant admin consent across my entire directory to this permission. Now, what does that mean? Well, admin consent is really useful if you're deploying a custom application or maybe a third-party application, and you don't want every user in your organization to see that screen. Do you give this third-party or custom application permission to do X, Y, Z? So a really good example is if your team built your own application and using a Microsoft Identity platform to handle logins and users, right? You wouldn't want for your custom organization's application for everybody the first time they interact with it to see that screen. Do you give this application permission? You can grant admin consent so we can bypass that. So I'm going to hit admin consent. And this is an application permission. So I'm giving this application webinar permission to user.readAll. That's very important. Webinar permission to user.readAll. And I automatically granted consent as an administrator of this directory. You wouldn't see this unless you're admin in the directory, so that this application doesn't get that consent screen. Now, starting from here, I think we got everything we need. So we're going to go back to Visual Studio Code, and we are going to create a new node application. So probably be easier to do this from the terminal. So let's just jump into the terminal. From here, I'm going to say npm init force. And this will allow me to create a new package.json file. Now, it has some defaults. I don't need all that stuff, so we're going to manipulate the defaults. Hey, I saw our first question. Somebody says, okay, I have an application, but I want to restrict authentication to specific accounts instead of all accounts. How do I do that? And my answer would be, we tend to think of things as authentication and authorization. So any user in my organization can authenticate. But are they authorized to access a certain application? Well, that's up to our application to determine. So when we have these permissions and stuff, we can set it up so that any user can authenticate, but if it's a custom application, use our custom applications code. If it's an Azure service, use a role-based access control. At that point, we can set up authorization. Now, I actually don't remember if this is still on the Microsoft website, but when I first authorization. When I first learned, there we go. The Microsoft Identity Platform has a really great documentation page that talks about the difference between authentication and authorization and how you should think about it as a developer. The short and long of it is that authentication is the act of this person proving who they are. So we never want to stop somebody from proving who they are. Anybody can log in and prove who they are. Authorization is the other side of it, whereas once you've proven who you are you authorized to access this resource. So a really good example of this is that, let's say we build an application where people can add containers to Azure storage. Anybody can authenticate to our application. Any member of our organization wants to authenticate can authenticate. But we use role-based access control to determine who's authorized to actually manipulate Azure storage. So we don't block people from logging in. We actually just block them from doing the actual task. So that's a great question. I'm going to publish that question and a link to this document in the Q&A for anybody who wants to read into that. And again, it's just one of those things where if you haven't read the documentation authentication versus authorization, I highly suggest you read it. I know this is going to sound hilarious, but the concept itself is ancient. I read about it when I was a consultant at a consulting firm, I want to say almost a decade ago, when it's part of the patterns and practices documentation. So it's one of those things where it's just, it's amazing that that document is not only still around, but Hasn't been changed much because conceptually, the concepts are still the same. But once you read it and understand it, it really helps put in your mind how all of this fits. All right, going back to our package.json file. We have our package.json file. It has a lot of stuff in here. I don't care. I'm not going to put in a version or description. Don't need keywords, author, or license. I'm going to keep it simple. Name, main, and scripts. So the name of this application is going to be server, node, msal. And for those who are curious, remember our GitHub repo has all of this code. Now the actual code we're going to run, I'm going to create a file called app.js. So here we go. New file, app.js. And then finally, under scripts, I'm going to create a start script, node app.js. The only other thing I'm going to add is a type. Now, this is really cool because if you like C# or Java, you come from object-oriented language, and you like a lot of the important libraries and type check and sanity check, especially if you're using stuff like TypeScript, setting your node type, node application type to module gives you a lot of that same functionality. You'll see me use this throughout. So we have our app.js file, and we're going to start bringing in libraries. The first library we're going to use today, going to go to npmjs.com. For those who are not familiar, npmjs.com is the Node Package Manager. So this the website for the Node Package Manager. This is where we can look up Node packages. Our Azure packages always start with a prefix of @Azure. And we looked at in our first session at Azure MSAL, which gave us a list of all the MSAL packages. Now we used MSAL and then MSAL browser in session 1, but today we're going to use MSAL Node, which is designed for server-side Node applications. So we're going to npm install at Azure MSAL Node, and then save. It just saves it to the package.json file so that anybody else who pulls down this project will also pull down this dependency. All right. Starting from an app.js file, we're going to import some stuff. So import confidential client application from Azure MSAL-node. This is our first import statement. What this basically says is that Azure MSAL node exposes a lot of types that we're interested in. Of those types, we only want to pull in confidential client application. So if you saw our first session, you've seen this before. We're going to start by creating a config object. So const config equals, and then we're going to create an auth object within that config object with our client ID, our authority, and this is all the stuff we've seen before. And within that config object, you can also configure other things like caching, token storage, how we refresh tokens, all that fun stuff. But today we keep it simple. So we'll go get our client ID, which is this good right here. Pop that in, and our authority is https login.microsoftonline.com/ and that will be our tenant ID. Now, in session 1, we go really deeply into this login.microsoftonline.com URL and all the different things you can put for authority. But today, we're just going to go with our tenant ID. Final thing we're going to do is we're going to put in a client secret. Since we're not logging in interactively, we need to give it something. Now, this is just a value here, but there's way more secure ways of doing this. Just for today, we're going to do this in plain text, but you can definitely use services like Key Vault, where you can inject environment settings through your past applications on Azure. You can do certificates instead of this raw secret value. We're just doing a plain text secret so that you can follow along the demo. All right, starting from here, we'll then create a client of type confidential client application, pass it in our config object. So we have client, a type confidential client application, pass it in our config, and then we're going to create a request. Now, our request, this is just like session 1, has an array of scopes, but this is where things get a little different. I can manually put in here https graph.microsoft.com/user.read.all, and that will be fine. It's not even case sensitive, so we could just do user.read.all, and everything will be good. But we can also use .default, which is dynamic. And what this allows us to do is say, hey, at the time of writing this application, I don't know what scope we're going to need, But when you try to perform something, if the user hasn't consented to that scope, go ahead in real time and consent them to that scope. So the great thing about this .default is it's dynamic. So when we try to read the user directory, we will or when we try to log in, it will actually read our Azure AD application registration and essentially include all the scopes that we've already set up there. For those who don't remember, we go back, we'll see that we have user.read, user.read.all. So that dynamic one's pretty useful. I don't have to manually type that out. So let our response equals await client.acquire token by client credential. This is cool because this allows us to say, let's go ahead and use our client secret, which is our client credential, and get a token. This is all a rehash of session 1, but again, I just want to call that out. If you haven't seen session 1, just go to our YouTube channel. All of this exact same code we did in session 1. The only difference is we're using a confidential client application instead of a public client application. All right. If I don't have any typos, this should just work. So npm start. And there we go. There's our response. Graph.microsoft.com.default. That's our dynamic scope. There's our access token. It's a bearer token. So knowing what we know, let's go ahead and fetch something from the graph. So npm install. This is just fetch is client side in the browser. If we're doing a server-side node application, we need to import a library with fetch in it. So there's a great one called node fetch. So we'll save that. We'll import the node fetch library. That way, we get a fetch method just like we would if we were in a browser. So import fetch from node fetch. And for those, we're just importing that fetch. So then all we need to do here is just say, let query equals, we'll call fetch asynchronously using the await keyword. So fetch HTTPS, just like we saw when we went to the Graph Explorer, graph.microsoft.com, version 1.0 endpoint, users. This will get the users in my directory. Now, this wouldn't work if we just did it right away because it needs a bearer token. So we'll create a headers object in its config with the authorization header. And this will have our bearer token. So bearer, looking back at, well, actually I cleared it out, but the property is response.access token. Normally I didn't clear this out and you see the access token. I apologize I cleared that out, but we're getting the response.access token. So that should be good. Let JSON equals await query.json. That should just get our JSON data. And we'll print that out to the console. So just walking through what this does real quick. We're calling graph.microsoft.com v1.0 users. We're passing in our response.access token from when we got the token as our bearer token in the authorization header. We're just getting the JSON for the response and then printing it to the console. So save, npm start. And there we go. We got our list of users in the directory. So pretty cool stuff. All right, but you didn't come here to see me walk you through the graph. That's session 4. What you came here to see is for me to show you how to do this, but with Azure services. And so the key to this is actually understanding the different Azure SDK ways of authenticating. So we're just going to take this all the way back to the top, and we are going to simplify things a little bit. I'm going to remove all of our import statements, and we're going to start from scratch, okay? So we'll start by going to npm.js, and let's look up the Azure library for Azure Storage. So Azure Storage, and there's a blob, a queue, and a file share. We're going to do storage blobs today. So we have the Azure Storage blob client library, and this is where we're going to go in and use this JavaScript library to access Azure Storage. So before we do that, we need to create an Azure Storage account. So, I'll just do that here. Create a resource, Azure Storage account. We're going to put this in our webinar resource group, and I'm just going to give it a random name. Put in ECUS, locally redundant storage. None of these settings really matter. I'm just for this demo, but I'm just going with the simplest, easiest option I can think of. So we're going to create a storage account, and then we're going to use this Azure Storage Blob library. Now it says, hey, you need to npm install the Azure Storage Blob library. And then we have lots of examples of things you can do. Import the package, create the Blob service client. You see how we do that. We'll go ahead and it talks about using Azure Identity if you want to log in. We'll talk about that in just a second. But all the things I'm going to show you today, these things, you're going to be able to see how we do those. So let's just jump in. There's our storage account. We are going to import two things. So import Blob service client from Azure Storage Blob. Now, I didn't get any IntelliSense, so that tells me I made a mistake. I forgot to actually import the Azure Storage Blob library and save it locally. So I apologize about that. Forgot that. There we go. Now we have our Blob service client. We'll also import the storage shared key credential. So now I have IntelliSense. That means I imported everything correctly. So here's how it works. We'll create a const with our credential. And it's equal to a new storage shared key credential. We need to pass in our account name and account key for storage. So I'm going to go back to the Azure portal. Here's our storage account. Where's our account name? That's right here. So I'll go ahead and copy that and paste that into Visual Studio Code. And then I need a key. So I'm going to go back to the Azure portal and go to access keys, go to hit show keys and grab one of my keys. Again, jumping back, paste that in. There we go. Now I'll create a new client, new Blob service client, passing in the endpoint that we want to access, and then our credential. Save that. So I need to go get the endpoint from the Azure portal. That was pretty easy. If you go down to, I believe, endpoints, you see the different endpoints for like Blob, Q, all the other types of storage components. Let's see. I don't know if I clicked the wrong button. There we go. So Blob service endpoint is the name of my account.blob.core.windows.net. Go ahead and copy that and paste it in. All right. From there, I can create a container by calling let container equals client.get container client. I'm going to call this my key container. And the container.create if not exists. This is asynchronous, so I need to await it. And what this will do is get the key container. If it doesn't already exist, it will create it. That's it. That's all the code we're going to do. So let's make sure I don't have any typos by running this. npm start. Oh, that was fast. So if I did everything correctly, I should be able to go to the Storage Explorer up here, say Blob containers, and there's my key container. Wonderful. So we already have one of our containers. You can also go to containers list and see our key container. That's another way to do it. Now that's one way to do it, the storage shared key credential, but there's all sorts of other ways to do it because we didn't come here to see how to do things with the keys. We came here to see how to do it with the Microsoft Identity platform. So we need to pull in an identity library from the Azure SDK. One of the great things about the Azure SDK is a lot of these libraries are unified, so they all use the same mechanisms for like setting up your identity, setting up your credentials. So there's a common library called Azure/Identity. And this common library includes everything you need if you want to use Azure AD to authenticate to these services. So I'm going to install this library, npm install Azure Identity, save. Whoop. Didn't mean to clear my screen there. And I'll clear here. And then I'm going to use this Azure Identity library. So I don't need storage shared key credential anymore. I'm going to import. I'm going to call this Azure Cli Credential from Azure Identity. And this one's cool. Watch what this one does. Const credential equals new Azure Cli Credential. Now, what this one does is it actually looks to the Azure CLI. If you're logged into the Azure CLI, it will use that credential. So instead of key container, I'm going to call this CLI container. I'm going to, just for fun, I'm going to easy log out. So I'm not logged into the Azure CLI. And I want you to see what happens if I try to run this and I'm not logged into the Azure CLI. So npm start. There we go. it says, hey, no subscription found, run AZ account set to select a subscription. So try to use the CLI. So AZ login to log into the Azure CLI. Let's see. I forget that I'm not signed in. So hit sign in. All right. I apologize. Just take a second. Open a browser tab on another window. There we go. I apologize about having to log in there. I use a password manager for everything at this point. All right, so we're logged in Azure CLI. It's going to load up all the subscriptions I have access to, which is way too many because I do a lot of consulting. So AZ account set subscription. And we were using the LRN subscription for all our demos today. So I'll set it to the LRN subscription. There we go. I can see that AZ group list will list all the resource groups I have access to, which is Cloud Shell and Webinar. So I'm definitely in the right subscription. So npm start using the Azure CLI credential. All right, it says, okay, I've logged in, but I want you to see all this metadata is printed out. It says authorization failure. See, this application does not have permission to access Azure storage. Remember I said that anybody authenticate, but are we authorized? Well, we have authorization failure, so we're not authorized. So I'm kind of glad somebody asked that question at the beginning, because you could have set me up any better than that to talk about authorization here. So let's start with talking about the our Azure Active Directory application registration. We have our webinar, Azure Active Directory application registration. Now we're going to set this application registration up so that people can get access to storage. So we're going to add a new permission. Remember I said I promised we're going to click other ones? Well, today we're going to go from Microsoft Graph to Azure Storage. So I'm going to select Azure Storage. And it says, okay, we have delegated permissions. You can impersonate a user when you access Azure Storage. Let's go ahead and do that. User impersonation, hit add permissions. And I'm going to grant admin consent because, again, this is an unintended use of it. All right, so we can log in, right? But that doesn't mean Webinar has permission to manipulate my storage account. I need to go in and actually explicitly set that up. So I'll go to storage account and I'm going to select access control. And from here, I'm going to go to role assignments. And I see I don't have any role assignments. So I'm going to add a new role assignment. So add role assignment. And there's all sorts of roles, but storage has its own. Well, I believe it's storage. If you search for storage, you'll see all the different ones for storage. I want to create a storage blob data contributor. So this person can't really do anything with the account, but he can add new data to the account. So that's perfect. Storage blob data contributor. And then for the people I'm going to assign this role to, I'm going to select user group or service principal. You can also select manage identity here, but today we'll do user group or service principal. And when I go to select members, it has the different principals in my directory. I'm going to search for webinar because that's the name of my Azure AD application registration. Select webinar and then assign that. So what this does now is that my unintended application that has this Azure AD application registration now is going to have the role of storage blob data contributor. That gives me the authorization to contribute new data to this Azure storage account. So we go back, npm start, and I might be a little fast on this. We'll see. All right, I'll just make sure everything, just give it a second. npm start. All right, I'm gonna just double check, make sure I didn't do anything wrong. Azure CLI credential, CLI container. Just jump back into the portal, make sure webinar, storage block data contributor, that's the one I'm using. All right. All right, go back. Just make sure this isn't something where I'm easy log out, easy log in. I apologize for this technical error. I was just doing this about an hour ago, so I wanted to make sure I've crossed my T's and dotted my I's. So I got AZ login, clear my screen, AZ account, set subscription LRN, clear my screen, npm start. Just double check in the portal. Two things I'm going to double check, and I'll just walk you through what I'm doing here. User impersonation set up for the Azure storage account has admin consent granted, so that's working as expected. I also have the access control for the storage account. Let me make sure the name for the storage account is right. SDZY. Yep. That's set to webinar here. Oh, I know what I've done wrong. So later on, we're going to use webinar to add data to the storage account, but I'm logged in the Azure CLI as Sydney Andrews. So let's add that role assignment. I can't believe I missed that. So storage blob data contributor. I'm logged in as Sydney Andrews to Azure CLI. So I hit next. So if I go select my name, Sydney Andrews, select, review and assign, save. There we go. I'm logged into the Azure CLI as myself, so I needed to add myself to the permissions list. Now, I really apologize about that. npm start. Give it a second. npm start. And make sure I gave it the right permissions. All right. And if this doesn't work, I'll pass this go past this demo, and then we will follow up on this. Now, I apologize about again missing some step somewhere. We may have to follow up. I'll follow up in session 4 on what I did wrong here. I can't quite figure it out right this second. Everything looks right to me, but I obviously made some mistake along the way with the configuration, just double checking Azure CLI credential, all that. Yeah, let's move on to the next demo, and I apologize about that. But that should work. I probably have some type of typo that I'm not thinking of right now because we're live and I'm just not thinking through it. So let me show you another type of Azure credential. So we have the Azure CLI credential. Let's try default Azure credential. And what this does is it reads our environment settings for certain environment values, like Azure Client ID, Azure Tenant ID, and Azure Client Secret. So we're going to use that instead of Azure CLI credential. Now, I haven't set any of my environment settings. So if I run this right now, it's going to fail. It's going to say can't read from the environment. All right. So what we need to do for this default Azure credential is set up environment settings. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to bring in a library that does that for me. It's called .env. So npm install .env, save. And what this does is it gives me the ability to create a .env file. So .env. And in here, we have our Azure Client ID equals, and then we can put in values for Azure Client ID, Azure Tenant ID, and then Azure Client Secret. And the cool thing about this is we can configure all of this so that when we work on our application here, it will use these environment variables. So import .env from .env. That one's pretty simple, right? And then we call .env.config, and that will read this file and set everything as environment settings. This is really great in dev if we want to just work with this. So from here, I'm going to get my client ID. I'm going to go grab my tenant ID, and I'll go grab my client secret and paste that in. There's my app.js file. We're using this default Azure credential now. And we are going to try, I'm going to do an env container using this. So if I got everything right, clear, npm start, and there we go. So if I go back to the portal and I say, I'm going to go to my storage account, go to containers, there's my env container. Now, we can also do this with the Msl library. So we have the default Azure credential, we have the Azure Cli Credential, we have the stored share key credential, but this is all implementing a special credential class. If you go to Blob Service Client, you'll see it's looking for something of type token credential. And so we can create our own class that implements that interface. So I'm going to remove this .env. I'm going to remove this default Azure credential. We're going to create our own. So we're going to create a class. I'm going to call this the Msl Azure Credential. Now, this class is going to be really cool because we're going to use the Msl library again. So import confidential client application from Azure. Azure Msl node. And we're going to implement this just like we did last time. So there's a method in here called async get token. If you're doing this in TypeScript, it's a little bit easier. Now, when this method calls to get a token, it's going to pass in the scopes that it needs. So that means the Blob Service Client library is going to pass in the scopes that it wants when it gets the token. So let's implement that method. So when it's asking for a token, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to create a constant config object with an auth object within it, client ID. And this looks very familiar because we just did this at the very beginning of this webinar, client secret. We are going to paste all that in. So our client secret from here, our tenant ID, HTTPS, login, Microsoft Online.com. And I don't think it's tenant ID, I think it was authority. Yeah. And then our tenant ID at the end of authority. And then our client ID. Save everything. We have our config object. The next thing we did is client equals new confidential client application, passing our config object. All the exact code for our request equals, and this is where it get a little different. Instead of manually setting our scopes, we're going to check this array of requested scopes. So array, is it an array? Requested scopes. If it's array, then we'll just pass it in. If it's not, we'll create a new array with the single property value requested scopes, because it can either be array or a string. So we handle that here. If it's an array, just use that. If it's just a string, put it in an array. All right, so let response equals await client dot acquire token by client credential, pass in our request, and then our get token method should return our token and when it expires. So token property is response.access token and expires on timestamp. And I'm looking to the side because I want to make sure I get this typed out correctly. It's response.expires on .get time. All right, so we have our new custom Msl Azure Credential class. We're using that to go to the blob storage client. We're going to create a new container called Msl container. So we did everything correctly. npm start. All right, so it ran successfully. Go back to our storage account, refresh, and there's our Msl container. So with this library, with these classes, we're able to just jump in. Again, we have the Azure Cli credential. We have the default Azure credential. All of those classes are available to us from the Azure Identity Library. We can build our own Azure Credential class if we want to implement our own login logic. Right now, I'm doing confidential client application, but if you want to do a public client application, so public client application with no client secret, and instead of acquiring token by client credential, you could go client, acquire token by code, by device code, by refresh token, username, password. You can acquire token in many different ways here. But the idea here is that we can implement this Msl Azure Credential class any way we want. And the great thing is that, let's see, I'll just show you an example. Acquire token by device code. We can say request, and then that will allow us to do the device code. And I'm just winging it here, so let's see if this works. I've never tried this one before. npm start. I'm trying to make up for messing up one of my demos. So npm start. All right, it says I need a callback. I'm really seriously trying this for the first time. So Azure MSAL node. Let's search for this. Okay, we have our different public client device code grant. So it says, okay, device flow token request. That's the one we're going to do. Initialize a public client application. MSAL public client application, configure authority. Wonderful. Acquiring tokens. We can get off code, get off token by code. Let's see, acquire token by device code. It says, here's what you need to do. You need to call device code request, and then you're going to get a response, and you can log that to the console. So let's try that out. Paste this in. Then response, console log, JSON stringify response. Let's try it out. I'm trying to make up for messing up one of the demos. So npm start. Let me see if it's a parameter for this response. What's that device code callback? Just go back to our documentation. In our request, we need a device code callback. Okay, that's not bad. So it says in the request, I need a device code callback. And so what this does is when it has the device code, we need to log the device code to the console. So let's try that out. This is some real-time debugging here, y'all. This was not in our show notes. It says I need to go to web browser, Microsoft.com, device login, enter this code. Control click. Microsoft.com device login, entered my code. All right, I need to go get my password one more time. Just give me a second. Yeah, sure. Stay signed in. Are you trying to sign in the webinar? Yes. All right. So if we go back here, is the request body must contain the following parameter: client associated, client secret. So looks like we have all sorts of stuff. So we can set up our redirect URI, HTTPS, localhost. Lots of cool stuff we could do. As you saw, that's how we set up the acquire token by device code. Going back, we could do a confidential client application like you see in the show notes. The biggest thing I wanted to really show off here is that this Msl Azure Credential class, as you just saw, allows you to customize how you get the token in any way that makes sense for your organization. So again, for this example, I'm playing around. You see I can implement device code, and I've actually never used the JavaScript version of this before. So you can see how I can look at the documentation, start implementing it, and it says, hey, I don't have a redirect URI, so I need to set all that up. But however we decide to set up, at the end of the day, though, we're able to customize the way we implement this and use this with any of the Azure SDK libraries. So we don't really have a lot of time to show this, but I'll just show you. I can pull in a library like Azure, I believe it's Azure Cosmos. Just double check, make sure I have the right name. Yeah, I could pull in a library like Azure Cosmos, and the Azure Cosmos library has its own implementation. Var client equals new Cosmos client. Need to provide an endpoint, and that would be HTTPS account name documents azure.com port 443, and then for AD credentials, we can pass in our credential object, and that works just as well here. We could go in and use this with other Azure SDK libraries. This is the JavaScript version. If you write in Java or .NET, all of the class names are almost identical. So a lot of the stuff like implementing this get token method, creating your own class, the confidential client application, public client application for MSAL, the Azure Cli Credential or default Azure Credential classes for the Azure Identity Libraries, they're almost all identical names. So you can use a lot of stuff you see in this demo moving forward. So last thing we want to do is just jump back to the slide that we had in the middle of our session. We showed a lot of demos today. We had a couple good questions, but if you're walking through this on your own and you have some more questions and need additional help with the series, msusdev@microsoft.com. I'm going to hang around for a couple more minutes to see if there's any more Q&A questions, but other than that, thank you so much for attending. We have all of our demos and source code, so everything I just showed you is on GitHub, just showing you real quick. All of the code I just walked you through is on GitHub. So if you want to walk through it yourself and try it out yourself, you're absolutely more than welcome to do that. The other side of things is the links that we provided throughout the Q&A. Please visit those links. If you haven't seen sessions 1 through 2, go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com, Microsoft Dev Radio. You can see the previous sessions. And then we invite you to register and attend our last session of Microsoft Graph SDK for JavaScript, where we will interact with the graph, but instead of using the fetch library, we'll use the Graph SDK that's really nicely named classes and fluent methods that make it so much easier to query data from the graph. So again, thank you so much. And Matt, I'm going to hand that right back to you.
Cool. Thanks so much, Sydney. Really actually enjoyed the improv today. And always learn a lot from watching you work things out in real time. So we'll get these recordings up, and thanks everyone for tuning in.